May 9, 1950. The French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman stands before journalists in Paris. World War II ended just 5 years ago. Europe is still devastated, cities in ruins, millions dead, economies shattered. France and Germany, enemies in 3 wars within 70 years, remain deeply suspicious of each other. The continent that dominated the world for centuries now lies prostrate, divided between American and Soviet spheres of influence. But Schuman has a revolutionary proposal, drafted by his colleague Jean Monnet. France and Germany will pool their coal and steel production under a common authority. Other European nations can join. It's a technical proposal about industrial commodities, but Schuman knows its real purpose. The pooling of coal and steel production, he declares, will make war between France and Germany not merely unthinkable, but materially impossible. This moment, now celebrated as Europe Day, begins the process that will create the European Union, the world's most ambitious experiment in supranational integration. This is the story of how nations that had fought each other for centuries chose cooperation over conflict, how economic integration became political union, how Europe transformed from battlefield to unified bloc, and how this project, always incomplete, always contested, reshaped the continent and influenced the world. To understand the European Union's formation, we must understand what came before: centuries of warfare. Europe's history was one of endless conflict, dynastic wars, religious wars, nationalist wars. The 30 Years' War killed millions in the 17th century. The Napoleonic Wars devastated Europe in the early 19th century, but nothing compared to the 20th century's catastrophes. World War I killed 16 million people and destroyed 4 empires. The Treaty of Versailles, meant to ensure lasting peace, instead created conditions for another conflict. Germany, humiliated and impoverished by reparations, became fertile ground for extremism. Within 2 decades, Europe was at war again. World War II was even more devastating. Over 60 million dead, cities obliterated, entire populations displaced. The Holocaust demonstrated civilization's fragility. Nuclear weapons revealed that future wars might extinguish humanity. By 1945, Europeans were exhausted, traumatized, and desperate to prevent another catastrophe. The question was how. Some believed balance of power, traditional European diplomacy, could work if properly managed. Others wanted international law and organizations like the United Nations. But visionaries like Jean Monnet, Robert Schuman, and Konrad Adenauer believed something more radical was needed: integrating European economies so tightly that war became impossible. If nations shared coal and steel, the sinews of war production, they couldn't fight without destroying their own economies. The immediate post-war situation was dire. Europe was divided. The Iron Curtain, as Churchill named it in 1946, split the continent between Communist East under Soviet domination and Democratic West aligned with America. Germany was partitioned into occupation zones. Millions were homeless, displaced, or starving. Economies had collapsed. The United States, through the Marshall Plan announced in 1947, poured billions into European recovery. The Marshall Plan required European cooperation for aid distribution, creating early habits of collaboration. But economic recovery alone wouldn't prevent future wars. Something deeper was needed: institutional structures binding nations together. Jean Monnet, a French economist and diplomat, believed in functional integration. Rather than grandiose political declarations, start with practical economic cooperation in specific sectors. Success in one area would create pressure for integration in others, the spillover effect. Eventually, economic integration would necessitate political integration. Robert Schuman, French foreign minister and Monnet's collaborator, presented this vision publicly on May 9, 1950. The Schuman Declaration proposed that French and German coal and steel production be placed under a common high authority, within an organization open to other European countries. This was revolutionary. nations would surrender sovereignty over strategic industries to a supranational body. Why coal and steel? These were war's essential materials. Control them and you control the capacity to make weapons. If France and Germany controlled these jointly, neither could secretly rearm. Moreover, the Ruhr and Saar regions, contested Franco-German borderlands rich in coal and steel, had been flashpoints for conflict. Joint management would diffuse tensions. Germany's Chancellor Konrad Adenauer embraced the proposal enthusiastically. Adenauer, a Christian Democrat who had opposed the Nazis, sought Germany's rehabilitation and integration into the West. The Schuman Plan offered a path. Germany would be treated as equal partner, not defeated enemy. For Germany, European integration meant redemption. Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg joined negotiations. Britain was invited but declined, uncomfortable with supranational authority and preferring its Commonwealth connections. In April 1951, the Six Nations signed the Treaty of Paris, creating the European Coal and Steel Community, ECSC. It began operating in 1952. The ECSC structure established patterns for future European institutions. A high authority, supranational executives making binding decisions, governed coal and steel policy. A council of ministers, representing national governments, provided oversight. A common assembly with delegates from national parliaments provided democratic input. A court of justice resolved disputes. This institutional framework, supranational executive, intergovernmental council, parliamentary assembly, independent court, would characterize European integration. The ECSC was a success. Coal and steel production increased, trade barriers between members fell, a common market in these commodities emerged. More importantly, Franco-German reconciliation advanced. Adenauer and French leaders developed trusting relationships. Europe's bloodiest rivals were becoming partners. Emboldened, European leaders attempted a leap forward. The European Defense Community, EDC. With the Korean War beginning in 1950 and Cold War tensions rising, the West needed military strength. But rearming Germany, just 5 years after Nazi defeat, was controversial. The EDC proposed integrating European military forces, including German troops, under supranational command. It was ambitious, perhaps too much so. The EDC treaty was signed in 1952, but ratification faced opposition. In France, Gaullists and communists opposed surrendering military sovereignty. In August 1954, the French National Assembly rejected the EDC treaty. The project was dead. European defense integration would remain NATO's domain for decades. The EDC's failure taught important lessons. Integration couldn't be rushed. Defense and foreign policy were too sensitive for supranational authority. Economic integration should proceed first, building trust and habits of cooperation. Political integration would follow, if at all. Undeterred, European leaders pursued economic integration. In June 1955, foreign ministers met in Messina, Italy. They agreed to pursue a common market, eliminating trade barriers, allowing free movement of goods, services, capital, and labor among members. Additionally, they would cooperate on atomic energy. Negotiations produced 2 treaties signed in Rome on March 25, 1957. The European Economic Community, EEC, created a common market and customs union. The European Atomic Energy Community, Euratom, promoted nuclear energy cooperation. These treaties of Rome, taking effect in January 1958, were the European Union's true foundation. The EEC aimed to eliminate tariffs and quotas between members, establish common external tariffs, and create common policies in agriculture, transport, and competition. Beyond economics, the treaty's preamble spoke of an ever closer union among the peoples of Europe. A deliberately vague phrase suggesting political integration might follow economic union. The institutional structure paralleled the ECSC. A commission, replacing the high authority proposing and implementing policy, a council of ministers making decisions, a parliamentary assembly providing oversight, and a court of justice interpreting treaties. The Commission, particularly, was supranational. Commissioners represented European interests, not national governments. The EEC's first decade was remarkably successful. Tariffs were eliminated faster than scheduled. Trade between members exploded. Economic growth was strong, the post-war economic miracle. Living standards rose. The 6 members prospered together more than they ever had separately. But success created tensions. Charles de Gaulle, becoming French president in 1958, was skeptical of supranational authority. De Gaulle was a nationalist who believed in strong, independent nation-states. He supported European cooperation but rejected federalism. In the empty chair crisis of 1965-66, France boycotted EEC institutions for 7 months, protesting Commission proposals that threatened French interests. The crisis was resolved with the Luxembourg Compromise, 1966, establishing that when very important interests were at stake, the Council would seek unanimous decisions rather than using majority voting. This preserved national vetoes, weakening supranational authority but keeping France engaged. It established a pattern. European integration proceeded through compromise between federalist visions and national sovereignty concerns. Britain's relationship with European integration was complicated. Britain had declined to join the ECSC and EEC, believing itself a global power with Commonwealth ties and a special relationship with America. But by the early 1960s, Britain's economy was stagnant while EEC members prospered. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan applied for membership in 1961. De Gaulle vetoed the application in 1963. He viewed Britain as an American Trojan horse that would dilute European integration and French influence. When Britain applied again in 1967, de Gaulle vetoed again. Only after de Gaulle's resignation in 1969 did negotiations resume. Britain, along with Ireland and Denmark, joined in 1973. Norway negotiated membership but voters rejected it in a referendum. The 1973 enlargement was significant. The EEC was no longer just the 6 founding members but a growing organization. But Britain would always be an awkward member, joining reluctantly for economic reasons, skeptical of political integration, frequently demanding special treatment. This tension would persist through Brexit nearly 50 years later. The 1970s and early 1980s were difficult. The 1973 oil crisis and subsequent stagflation challenged European economies. Integration seemed to stall. Eurosclerosis, critics called it. New members Greece 1981, Spain and Portugal 1986 were welcomed, but these were poorer countries that would strain EEC finances. The Common Agricultural Policy, CAP, consuming most of the EEC budget, became controversial, subsidizing farmers at consumers' expense and distorting global agricultural markets. Yet important developments continued. In 1979, the European monetary system was established, linking member currencies to promote exchange rate stability. That same year saw the first direct elections to the European Parliament, previously appointed by national parliaments. Though the Parliament had limited power, direct elections increased its democratic legitimacy. The decisive breakthrough came in the mid-1980s. Jacques Delors, becoming European Commission President in 1985, pushed for completing the single market, eliminating all remaining barriers to free movement of goods, services, capital, and labor. The Single European Act, 1986, set a 1992 deadline and introduced qualified majority voting in the Council for single market legislation, ending the national veto's paralysis. The Single Market Initiative energized European integration. Businesses supported it, seeing economic opportunities. Citizens appreciated easier travel and shopping. The project succeeded. By 1993, the single market largely functioned. Goods, services, capital, and people could move freely across borders. It was the EEC's greatest achievement since its founding. But Delors wanted more: monetary union. A single market with multiple currencies was incomplete. Exchange rate fluctuations complicated trade. Transaction costs were high. A single currency would deepen integration and make the single market work better. Monetary union was also political, a major step toward political union, making it controversial. The Maastricht Treaty, signed in February 1992, transformed the European Economic Community into the European Union. It established a three-pillar structure: the European Community Economic Matters under supranational authority, common foreign and security policy intergovernmental cooperation, and justice and home affairs, also intergovernmental. More dramatically, it created a path to monetary union and a single currency, the euro. Monetary union required convergence criteria: low inflation, sound public finances, stable exchange rates. Countries meeting these could adopt the euro. A European central bank, independent of political control, would manage monetary policy. It was ambitious: monetary union without fiscal or political union. Critics warned this was unstable. Could monetary policy fit diverse economies? What if a member faced economic crisis? Maastricht's ratification was contentious. Danish voters rejected it in a referendum, later approving it with opt-outs. France approved it narrowly, 51%. British ratification was tortuous, requiring political sacrifices. The treaty revealed that European integration, once an elite project supported by vague public consensus, now faced popular skepticism. Euroscepticism emerged as a political force. On January 1, 1999, the euro was launched for electronic transactions in 11 countries. Greece joined in 2001. On January 1, 2002, euro coins and notes entered circulation. National currencies, the French franc, German Deutsche Mark, Italian lira, disappeared, replaced by a common currency. It was unprecedented, sovereign nations voluntarily surrendering monetary sovereignty. The euro's introduction was smooth technically, but economic problems emerged. Southern European countries, Greece, Portugal, Spain, Italy, had high debts and weak competitiveness. The euro's interest rates, set for the entire eurozone, were too low for overheating southern economies and too high for sluggish northern ones. The eurozone lacked mechanisms to handle divergence. Meanwhile, the EU kept expanding. Austria, Finland, and Sweden joined in 1995. The Big Bang enlargement of 2004 added 10 countries, 8 former communist states: Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, plus Cyprus and Malta. Bulgaria and Romania joined in 2007. The EU now had 27 members from the Atlantic to the Black Sea. Eastern enlargement was momentous. It reunited Europe after Cold War division. It extended democracy, rule of law, and prosperity to former communist countries. But it also strained the EU. New members were poorer, requiring substantial aid. Labor migration from east to west caused tensions. Culturally and politically, Eastern European countries were more conservative, nationalist, and Eurosceptic than Western founders. The EU was growing larger but not deeper. The Constitutional Treaty, signed in 2004, attempted to streamline the EU's complex institutions and decision-making, but French and Dutch voters rejected it in 2005 referendums. The EU faced an identity crisis. Citizens felt disconnected from Brussels bureaucracy. Integration was moving faster than public support allowed. The Lisbon Treaty, 2007, signed after years of negotiation, salvaged much of the constitutional treaty's content without the word constitution. It streamlined decision-making, strengthened the parliament, and created a president of the European Council and High Representative for Foreign Affairs. Ireland initially rejected it, but approved it in a second referendum with concessions. Then came the euro crisis. The 2008 global financial crisis exposed the Eurozone's weaknesses. Greece revealed its public finances were far worse than reported. Investors panicked. Greek borrowing costs soared. Ireland and Portugal faced banking and debt crises. Spain's economy crashed after a property bubble burst. Italy's massive debt became unsustainable. The Eurozone lacked mechanisms for such crises. It had monetary union without fiscal union, no common budget, no debt sharing, no transfer mechanism. Germany, the economic powerhouse, was reluctant to bail out profligate Southerners. But letting Greece default risked contagion. Italy and Spain falling next could destroy the euro. After agonizing negotiations, bailouts were arranged. The European Financial Stability Facility, later the European Stability Mechanism, provided loans to struggling countries conditional on harsh austerity measures, spending cuts, tax increases, structural reforms. The European Central Bank eventually pledged to do whatever it takes to save the euro, including potentially unlimited bond purchases. The crisis was contained but at enormous cost. Greece experienced depression-level unemployment and economic contraction. Youth unemployment in Spain exceeded 50%. Austerity caused widespread suffering. Politically, the crisis fueled extremism. Left-wing parties like Syriza in Greece and right-wing nationalists elsewhere gained support. The EU, once associated with prosperity, was now blamed for hardship. The euro crisis revealed fundamental flaws. Monetary union without political union was unstable. Divergent economies couldn't all thrive under single monetary policy. Richer countries wouldn't transfer wealth to poorer ones without political integration. But political integration was impossible without popular support, and support was declining. The refugee crisis of 2015-16 worsened matters. Syrian civil war and Middle Eastern conflicts drove over 1 million refugees to Europe. Germany, under Chancellor Angela Merkel, initially welcomed refugees. "We're schaffen das, we can do this." But other countries, especially in Eastern Europe, refused to accept quotas. Hungary built border fences. The Schengen system of passport-free travel, one of the EU's proudest achievements, nearly collapsed as countries reinstated border controls. The crisis divided Europe. Germany accused Eastern Europeans of lacking solidarity. Eastern Europeans accused Germany of imposing policies unilaterally. Right-wing nationalist parties across Europe exploited anti-immigrant sentiment. The EU seemed unable to handle crises collectively. Then came Brexit. In 2016, British voters narrowly approved leaving the EU 52% to 48%. The decision shocked the world. Britain had been a reluctant member, but leaving seemed economically irrational. Yet Euroscepticism, immigration concerns, and nostalgia for British sovereignty prevailed. Brexit negotiations, lasting from 2016 to 2020, were acrimonious. Britain wanted frictionless trade access without accepting EU rules, free movement, or budget contributions. Cherry-picking. The EU couldn't allow without encouraging other departures. The final deal, reached in December 2020, established trading arrangements but created barriers, particularly for services. On January 31, 2020, Britain left the EU. The Union's first-ever shrinkage was a symbolic and practical blow. Yet Brexit paradoxically strengthened European unity. Remaining members recognized the EU's value more clearly. Support for the EU increased in other countries. The UK's post-Brexit struggles, economic disruption, trade barriers, Northern Ireland tensions, deterred others from following. The COVID-19 pandemic in 2020-21 was another test. Initial responses were uncoordinated: border closures, export bans on medical equipment. Italy, devastated early, received little help, but the EU recovered impressively. In July 2020, leaders agreed to a €750 billion recovery fund, Next Generation EU, financed by common borrowing. This was unprecedented, the EU issuing debt collectively to support members. It suggested movement toward fiscal union. The recovery fund's approval required northern countries, particularly the Netherlands and Frugal Four, Austria, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, to accept financial transfers to southern countries. This reflected solidarity and recognition that collective challenges required collective responses. The pandemic, thus, advanced integration that previous crises had stalled. Today, the EU has 27 members and 450 million citizens. It's the world's largest single market and second largest economy. Citizens enjoy free movement, consumer protections, environmental standards, and human rights safeguards. The EU has preserved peace among members for over 70 years, its fundamental achievement. It's won the Nobel Peace Prize, 2012, for its contribution to peace and democracy. Yet challenges remain. Populist, nationalist parties oppose the EU across the continent. Poland and Hungary's democratic backsliding creates rule-of-law crises. Climate change requires coordinated action. Migration remains divisive. The relationship with post-Brexit Britain needs management. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 raised security questions about European defense and energy dependence. The EU's future is uncertain. Will it deepen integration, fiscal union, common defense, federal structure, or remain a confederation of sovereign states cooperating pragmatically? Will it expand further, including Western Balkans, eventually Ukraine, or consolidate current membership? Will populism erode it from within, or will crises strengthen solidarity? The European project has always been incomplete, always evolving, always contested. It began as a coal and steel community and grew into a political and economic union. It reflects Europe's determination to transcend nationalism's catastrophic history. But it also faces tensions between supranational authority and national sovereignty, between solidarity and self-interest, between expansion and deepening, between efficiency and democracy. From Schumann's declaration to the Euro's introduction, to Brexit's shock to pandemic recovery bonds, European integration has been a journey of ambitious vision and pragmatic compromise. It's prevented war among traditional enemies, enabled prosperity, protected human rights, and created something unprecedented: a voluntary union of sovereign nations pooling sovereignty for collective benefit. The European Union isn't finished. It never will be. The founders spoke of ever closer union, a process, not a destination. Each generation of Europeans must decide what union means, how close it should be, what purposes it serves. The project requires constant renegotiation between ideal and reality, between vision and compromise. That May morning in 1950, when Robert Schuman proposed pooling coal and steel, he didn't know where it would lead. He couldn't have imagined a single currency, open borders from Portugal to Finland, or a union of 27 nations. But he knew Europe needed something radically different if it was to escape its violent past. 70 years later, despite crises and challenges, the EU stands as proof that nations can choose cooperation over conflict, that integration can preserve peace, and that Europe's future can be different from its past. Whether that remains true depends on choices yet to be made.